Hi everyone, welcome to this video on lesson 4 of the reproduction scheme. This lesson is on the menstrual cycle, and it's a really important lesson because actually if students understand the menstrual cycle and they can relate that to this broader idea of fertilization, then they've got a really good chance of understanding everything that comes in the subsequent 4 or 5 lessons that cover fertilization and gestation and contraception and so on. Because actually the menstrual cycle, as you see a lot in biology, you get these cycles which human beings have I suppose, identified to help organize our experience, just like the carbon cycle or the circulatory system or whatever. We can see that we have these repeating patterns, and it just helps students kind of lay all of these ideas to one another, and that's what constitutes understanding, rather than just remembering stuff without really getting how it all fits together. As we've said or as I've said in other videos for this scheme of work, this is not just a science lesson. This is also a bit of a PSHE lesson, because obviously students will want. They need to know about reproduction and family planning and so on. So it's really important that we do this in a rigorous way, not only so that they can go and study organisms in a biological sense later on, but also so that they're ready to go out into the world and make informed choices about how they're going to live their lives. So when I'm teaching the menstrual cycle, I would have 4 diagrams, a bit like you can see in the slides, and you wouldn't necessarily need to do this under the visualizer. That said, I think it is quite helpful to do this one under the visualizer and build it up step by step. That doesn't mean you have to draw these out from scratch in front of students. You could have a printed version of these or draw them in advance in your book like I've done here. And it's important that we talk through each stage of the menstrual cycle, but always come back to this idea of fertilization. Everything in this unit comes back to fertilization. Why do we have all of this stuff? Why is it that girls will notice when they get to kind of their teenage years that they start to menstruate? All of it comes back to the idea that this is how human beings reproduce because of fertilization. So the way, hopefully that will come through when I go through how I would explain this. Now, this will be day 1. I've followed what's in the slides, so this will be day 1. But actually, I think for me, it kind of makes a bit more sense to start at day 5, at the end of the period. And we'll come back to here and we'll put the days on later. But firstly, what I want to do is just talk through what's actually happening inside the female's body. So the first thing that I would talk about at day 5 here, and again I'm going to put the days on at the end, but the first part of my story that I'm going to tell to students is that what you get is that inside the 2 ovaries, on either side of the uterus, inside the 2 ovaries, at some point in this cycle, which we will find out is day 5, at some point eggs start to form inside the ovaries, and at this point what happens as well is that we start to get a little bit of thickening of the lining of the uterus here, and I'm going to do that in red for obvious reasons, because that's going to be the same colour as the blood that happens during menstruation. So we start to get this thicker lining, and again we want to bring students thinking back to fertilization. The reason the egg starts to mature is, well, obviously we need an egg, otherwise fertilization wouldn't be able to happen. The reason the lining starts to thicken is because after fertilization occurs, this is where it's going to get implanted into. So we need a nice thick wall in order for the baby, if fertilization occurs, to grow inside the uterus. That needs to be really strong to hold the baby in place. So this is, for me, a good place to start. Now, at some point, and this is at day 14, as we'll find out later, but you can just say at some point after the eggs in the ovaries have been maturing for a while, one of the eggs will be released. So this is released from the ovary here into, let's do it on this side, it's released into the oviduct. And you might want to label these as well, so we could label that this is an ovary, these are the eggs, the lining of the uterus. So I might put uterus lining thickens and go through this with students. So this is day 14 and this is the oviduct here. So you can say the egg is released into the oviduct, sometimes called the fallopian tube, but we're going to call it the oviduct, okay? And this process of the uterus lining thickening is still going on here. So I can exaggerate this a bit here like this. So this is much thicker now. And it's worth stressing to students that the egg is only going to be around here in the oviduct for a couple of days. And this is important because actually, and especially, you know, when people get to their 30s or maybe even before, but people start to think about this a bit more, actually it's worth students knowing that there's only a couple of days where fertilization is likely to occur. So it's just after that middle point of the period, which as we'll see is day 14. There's a couple of days when the egg is in the oviduct and fertilization might happen. Now again, obviously we've got to balance this. What we don't want students to think is, oh well, as long as I don't have unprotected sex on those 2 days, then I'm going to be fine. Fertilization is not going to occur. And you can tell them, well, sperms actually can sit in the oviduct for up to a week after sex, so you kind of want to be careful about that. This is where it's really tricky. We have to be science teachers and just tell them the facts in an objective way. We also have this kind of public health PSHE role where we have to tell them to be careful about the choices they make. But anyway, this is the second stage. Now, if the egg is not fertilized, and it's important that we stress this, that fertilization will happen in the oviduct, but if that doesn't happen, then the cycle continues. And what we're going to see in a later lesson is what happens if fertilization does occur, and that is a really, that's a kind of fork in the road really for the female reproductive system, and that's important. But for now, we need to emphasize to students what we're going to talk about next in the menstrual cycle is what happens if fertilization does not occur. So if fertilization does not occur, well, the lining of the uterus continues to thicken. So now I'm going to draw it really thick like this until at a certain point the body realizes, let's say, I'll come back to that word realizes in a minute, but the body realizes that fertilization hasn't occurred, and actually we don't need this nice thick lining of the uterus anymore. That is going to be lost. So then this becomes a lot thicker, and this is what's called menstruation. So I'll label this as menstruation, and of course students will know that probably more likely as a period. So I can label it as a period as well. But again, what they need to understand is that's only going to happen if there's no sperm to fertilize this egg. We'll come back to the what happens if fertilization happens later. Now, I said something about the female reproductive system realizes that fertilization hasn't occurred. This is a nice example here of how a Key Stage 3 lesson on this topic is going to be different to a Key Stage 4 lesson on this topic. So at Key Stage 4, we're going to talk about hormones. We're going to phrase all of this, FSH is causing the kind of egg to start being produced, and then estrogen is involved as well. LH triggers the release of the egg, and so on. At Key Stage 4, they'll see all those graphs of over the 28 days, what are the different proportions of the different hormones. That's for Key Stage 4. Right now, we're just giving them this qualitative overview of what happens during the menstrual cycle in really, really simple terms. So you don't need to worry about hormones at this stage. Obviously, if you've got a group who you think are ready for that, then please do explain about the hormones. Having said that, that's something they'll learn about hormones in the Human Body Part 2 scheme in Year 8, so you might want to just save it until then. But so far we've just told the story. Now what you want to show to students finally is to say, well, this whole sequence of events is actually a cycle. It just keeps happening until fertilization occurs. And we say that this part here is day 1 of the cycle. So I'm going to start here with day 1 of the cycle, because it's day 1 of the cycle, even though I started my story here. I think that's a more sensible place to start, but we can then say, we say the start of the cycle is when menstruation begins. And we say that because it's just a really easy point to measure. You can very obviously observe when menstruation starts to happen. This happens at about day 5. And again, you can emphasize to students that periods might last different amounts of time for different people. In fact, the whole cycle can last different amounts of time for different people. And vary between months as well. But roughly, after about 5 days, menstruation stops, lining starts to thicken. Typically, this happens at about day 14. So about 2 weeks after menstruation begins, that's roughly when the egg is going to be released. So that's when a female is going to be fertile and ready for fertilization. And then this is kind of ongoing between day 14 and day 1, but we can call this, for the purposes of argument, day 28. And essentially what we want students to see is that this just repeats endlessly, or not endlessly, every month, let's say, until, we're not going to talk about the menopause today, but for a long period of a female's life, this just goes on and on until fertilization occurs. It's really important that you give students this overview of the menstrual cycle in this lesson, because then every subsequent lesson we're going to look at different cases. Okay, what would happen if here fertilization occurs? Or how can we use contraceptives to either stop this happening or as a barrier to stop fertilization occurring and then continue this cycle? So everything that we do in the next few lessons is going to come back to this picture. And it's really important that you frame everything you've talked about today in terms of our big idea in this scheme of work, which is fertilization.